Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Low Code Cafe webinar, episode 31. This episode is also known as Reza's Redemption because he will continue demoing a system that we saw 2 editions ago, if I remember correctly. It was a value calculator, and today we'll see how it was built behind the scene, the workflow techniques, and so on. For those of you that are new to this webinar, know that it's a weekly event that we are doing on every Wednesday. And it's an event where we bring in the team and the community to discuss mostly technical and community topics. All these webinars are recorded and they are posted on our YouTube channel, and I will post the link in the chat window in a few. So make sure to go in, subscribe. We also make a very good job at bookmarking all the parts of this webinar, so it's easy to navigate backwards and see the parts that interest you most. Usually the agenda is the same. We start with the community updates, and I will give you some very interesting updates in a few. And then we move towards seeing the product updates, what's coming, what's upcoming releases. And then we have a hands-on episode that's from support from our support channel. The topics, the interesting topics that were raised in the previous week, we bring in and discuss the solutions for them. And finally, the biggest chunk of this webinar is where we look at building a system with Plantain app, with low code, or how it was built, or looking at various patterns or various techniques to build such systems. So make sure to engage with us in any way possible, chat, Q&A, and so on. Moving on to some updates, as most of you already know, we are doing fundraising and have been doing so for the past few months. And I'm proud to announce that we reached 1 million, our milestone of 1 million in funding through the 2 campaigns that we ran so far. So we had the seedling campaign that we raised $700,000, and with this Republic campaign, we reached 1 million. The Republican campaign will be closing on Friday. So this is the last chance to go in and invest. And also there's like a cap at $400,000. So there's only a few room left for investors. So this is the last chance. We will not do other equity crowdfunding in the future. Most likely will not do them. So this is the last chance to be a part of the Plantain app journey. Cool. And usually we have this episode from the trenches that today is called Missing in the Trenches, because Dale Warner is not with us today. And it's actually a very cool story. After having done 30 webinars with Plantain app, his career moved on. So now he's playing in a movie. It's called The Chosen. So that's funny fact, but he'll never forget where he started from, and we'll see him again next week. So we are moving directly to the next part of our webinar, which is bringing in our head of product, Reza, to give us the product roadmap and updates, but also to show us the value calculator system that he built. So Reza?
No pressure there. Thank you, Bogdan. Need to share. There we go. Okay, so just a quick update. We are putting the final touches on release 112. We're in heavy duty last testing, user acceptance testing, this sort of thing. Quick note, there are a couple hot fixes out there for 1.11. As I mentioned before, some security related. And there was an issue found if you are trying to create a new token namespace. The pop-up wasn't quite working right. So that has been put out there in 1.11 as well, and is available right now. Otherwise, all of that plus much more will be in 1.12. The big focus of 1.12, there was a lot of good stuff in this one. Workflows is kind of our big bet and where we're headed over the next couple releases. You know, we've been talking a lot about being able to import and export applications and things like that. And I think, you know, workflows is where we're breaking the ground through to that. And so in this release, and I'll be demoing workflows and things today, There's some new features and things around being able to obviously import, export workflows. So that's been a long time coming, as well as specify like required inputs and just making it easier to save and test within the workflows. So we'll be seeing me do some of that stuff today, and I'll give you a quick peek of these new features and workflows before we jump into the building of the app. There's also been a lot of enhancements around the entity builder, things we're doing with permissions, and being able to make it easier to expose the application to non-signed in users. There's new page manager. So again, trying to lessen the reliance on the persona bar and give you everything you need right within app builder or page builder. Also big enhancements in logging. So all these logs that are scattered throughout the disk on your server, you may have access to it through FTP or remote connection, that sort of thing. No more need to do that. All of these things will be presented to you and you'll be able to download them and check them out. And then just a lot of bug fixes and small enhancements and things. And so that is what's coming, and hoping to have ourselves code complete on Friday. There's a couple of people already having access to this build and been helping us test. Thank you. And this should be shipping next week at this time. Can make it available ahead of time if someone wants to help us out, kick the tires, or just eager to get your hands on some of the new features. With that said, I wanted to show you on workflows a couple of new things that are in the workflows now. So got just a very, very simple workflow here. All this one really does is just take in a parameter and set it into context, which was last week's theme, and then output a result to you. First thing you'll notice though is that on the inputs now, you have a couple of options. Let me zoom in, I'm sure my screen is kind of small for everyone. So you can now, optionally, both of these, is check a box and make the input parameter required. And so what this will do, a lot of times when you're inside of the workflow, you are having to trap and capture, do I have a value? Like my whole workflow depends on this. Maybe I'm sending an email and I need to know who I'm sending it to. If I don't have that, things are going to fail, right? I'm trying to generate a PDF. If I don't have some kind of content to put into the PDF, things are going to fail. So prevent that either inside of your workflow itself by trying to put some splits in, or conditionally checking and running your actions only if this thing is not empty and all of that kind of stuff. You don't need to do that anymore. If you set something to required, now, not just in the workflow tester, but in your application, when you go to run the workflow, or your user does, it will return a message back now to the user, to you, so that you can see that a required input was not given, and it won't even try to run the workflow. So you don't get into situations, especially with complex workflows, where maybe a few of the steps ran, you touched the database, you started inserting a record, but now you go to the next step and you're missing some required information, and things are going to fail and you leave yourself in a half-empty state. A kinder, gentler version of not allowing anything through is to put a default value in, right? And you can say, hey, I don't have to have something from them, but I maybe either will degrade gracefully, or I can take a default behavior by saying, if nothing is given to me by the user, then I will assume this. And then you can handle that case inside of the workflow as a protection, or just run things in a default manner. So it almost gives you the ability to do overrides. A great example here is, maybe we'll do something like this while we're building here in a minute, is what mode am I in, right? A lot of times workflows, and we now have the ability to clone workflows, import, export them. You're going to start getting a lot of workflows, and sometimes workflows are very, very similar to each other. They just do something a little bit different, right? And so instead of making two different workflows, you can maybe say, what mode am I in? Or a great example is, am I in test mode or production mode? And you can put some conditions in. And so maybe there's a test mode where you want to run all the steps, but not actually send an email, or not actually update the database, but get your outputs and see that the logic in the workflow is working. So you could make yourself a parameter like that, default it to test, and only in your application, on your button clicks, that sort of thing, would you pass in production or live so that it runs it fully, right? So these, use your creativity, but it's a couple of powerful capabilities. The other one I want to show you here is this save and test. So before you would save and close, go back to the list of workflows, find the workflow, hit the little play button, run a test, maybe get an error back or a result you weren't expecting, or you're just incrementally building the steps as you go. And now you've got to hit edit, go back in, rinse and repeat. So now just right from within the workflow that you're in, even while you're building, you'll notice if I say something like Reza, all this is going to do is echo back out to me the message of hello, Reza, right? But if I don't pass anything in, it's going to say hello world, right? And it's using my default. So you can only use one of these at a time, right? So it doesn't make sense to mark something as required and have a default because it's never going to be empty, right? And so if you have it required, it's not going to let you do the default. If you have a default value in, it won't let you check the required. They kind of, you're doing one or the other. As I showed, you've got the ability to save and test from anywhere. So I could have just made a change here real quick. Message could be like successful. I save and test, I run, my change is right there. I want to make something different. I just dismiss this. I keep working. So this should really speed things up and help you not kind of lose your focus and things that you have set up. Last thing I wanted to show is one that we've kind of been teasing for a while now and are really excited about, is the ability to export and import workflows. And so you now have an extra button at the tabular listing view of your workflows. You can do these between applications, even within the same application. Probably doesn't make as much sense in the same application because you do have a clone function here. So normally you would do this from a separate app that you have. So something that is just handy, you reuse a lot. I'll show a couple of examples here in the builder by. Things that are common is that I like to make little simple workflows for is sending emails, so that I don't have a million send email actions everywhere, but I have a workflow to send the email. And then universally I handle email sending the same way, or generating a PDF file, right? You kind of set up all those settings. You don't need to clone that action and copy it all over the place. And then if something changes, you've got to go find everywhere and change it. You just change your workflow. So even just one-step workflows are worth reusing and sharing inside your applications. You have two ways to handle the export. If you have everything available and open right now, you're working between the two systems, you can just do a simple copy. And then in the target system, you'll hit import, and it's going to give you the option to either paste the values in and run the import, or the other option, and I can show it, is to download your workflow as a file and then import it as a file. And so in this case, I'm going to go ahead and bring this in. It's the one we just had. It takes me right into it. I can work with it whenever I want. I go back and you see that I now have that very workflow we were just showing. I could also save it as a file and pick a location for it and pull it in. So I'll just go ahead and do that. And then if I wanted, I can say, hey, I'm importing, and it's going to say, choose your file. I'll pick a different one here and be bold. So totally different workflow I'd exported before, but actually I picked the same one, but you get the idea. So now you can export and import these workflows. We're going to keep building on this functionality. So, sometimes these workflows by themselves can be very powerful, or the crux of what you're building, your business logic is really here. I'm going to make it so that you can maybe group these, select several workflows. And so this is kind of where we're headed with this, right? Maybe the gist of your app is 4 or 5 or 6 workflows that work together. You'll be able to kind of package them up and say, look, I want to export all of these into a file. We're going to have a marketplace that you can share these publicly, privately, sell them, this sort of thing. This is all where we're headed, and that'll all be packaged up and several workflows can come in. The next step of that then is that, hey, some of these workflows that you're making, or the logic, I mean, when you have little utilities like making PDFs or things like that, they stand alone, right? But sometimes you might have something, one of these days I'd like to show you a pattern, and maybe if we keep going with this builder by for a logging of metadata that you can set up for yourself and get a lot of analytics and troubleshooting and different things for yourself in your workflows. It's a workflow itself, but it relies on an entity that's going to store data, and it's pushing data into an entity. And so there's dependencies that you may need. So right now you'll import and export these. You'll want to check them out and go, oh, one of the steps in here is it's updating or reading from an entity. I need to go ahead and make sure I have that entity in my new target application. In the future, what we're solving for, near future, is let me also get those dependencies and bring everything in together. And therefore, we now have our first steps of being able to share applications and move things between environments and things like that. So that's where we're headed. A lot of good stuff. This is all coming in the next week. So things are working pretty good. Any questions just before I move into the builder by?
Yes, we got the questions from Rado.
I don't have the Zoom in front of me. Please read.
Does the default value support tokens as well?
Yes, great question. And yep, we foresaw that, and absolutely it does. So it would only be half as handy if it didn't. So yes, it supports it. Cool. Great question. All right, so let's take a look here at our calculator from last week, and or 2 weeks ago. And if you remember, it basically, and for folks that weren't on, it's taking, you have a lot of times you're faced with a situation where you want to look at, does it make sense to buy a software off the shelf or build it myself? And especially if you're a Plantain app user, I think you're always asking yourself this question, and we tend to lean to, I should build it. But sometimes that doesn't make sense. And when we take our heart and preference out of it and maybe look at it financially, it really comes down to some few formulas, right? And one is, well, what does it cost in a license or per year recurring to buy a thing? And what does it cost to build my own, right? And so there are so many softwares and different things out there that have little monthly subscriptions and stuff like that. And so this tool, our aim here is to say, well, if I pick that, help desk software, marketing software, messaging, there's just so many things, right? And they add up. And so you can say, okay, well, if I was going to buy that, what does it cost? And if I was going to build it, well, what will that cost me? And so we kind of flat plug in the buy cost, but where we have more levers to pull and questions to kind of ask is on the build side. And so it really comes down to how many people are going to take how long to build it in months, and what do they cost? And then it will go and calculate, here's what the initial build is, but then there's always maintenance ongoing usually. Only time an app is not changing is when it's set to be retired, right? So there's always a little care and feeding and updates and things and little enhancements and stuff that need to go on. And so you say, okay, well, I think this will probably be a day or two, a month, or whatever you think, worth of ongoing maintenance after that initial build. And then it does some math for us, and it comes and says, based on that, here's maybe you're spending $100 a year to buy something, and you're spending $50 a year to maintain what you've built. And how long will it take to recover your build investment before this becomes profitable to you? And the guidance is that anytime you're going to break even in 3 years or less, you should build it. If it's going to take longer than 3 years, and the longer it gets out from that, you should buy. It's not worth it. And so that's kind of what we have set up here. And when we were looking at this last time, we were seeing kind of the traditional way, the non-workflow way of doing things. And I had a couple of buttons, a couple of scenarios. One where I'm initially doing my create of the record, filling it out for the first time, and it has a whole bunch of steps. And then also I've got the editing of it, and it has a bunch of the same steps. And so out of the box, if I'm just typing the data in and I'm a human calculator, not such a big deal, right? I'm taking the form fields and I'm using a create action into my entity to just plug all the values in. But I wouldn't need this if I could calculate it all in my head. And also there's some need a lot of times to maybe run a few different scenarios, right? And so I want to store this, I want to save it, and I want to be able to reference it. And so what we were looking at, and everything below this red line, the bottom red line, I'll zoom a little more here, these were all the different steps that I had set up, right? Before I was going to just update the data, I needed to take my fields and start doing these calculations and the math. And what we quickly saw was when I hit the save button, I had an error, and it's saying you need to go look at your logs. And the log is just like, hey, this, something a little bit generic. It's not super logger where it's like you've got a little decimal or rounding error or something like that, or a syntax error. A lot of things can go wrong. And it was very hard for me in that session, hence the redemption here, is that I really couldn't quickly find what was wrong and which step was it in. And the more I hit the button, the more I was partially putting data in and bad data in and just kind of creating a mess of things. And so the idea was I left all of the different things I was doing. Calculating the costs is the kind of one step. Once I know what it costs, I can now do the math to figure out what kind of savings I'm going to have. Once I have the cost and the savings, I can now calculate how long it'll take me to break even. Once I know how long it'll take me to break even, I can kind of do my condition that says, well, if it's less than 3 years, then you should build it. If it's more than 3 years, you should buy it. And you can see I have these, and I'm sure you run into this in your travels plenty when you're doing this linear all or nothing type push the button and it either happens or it doesn't. You start putting all these conditions in place. That's like, don't run this action if. Well, but if I made it to here and this was like this, run this. A little bit of that's okay, but it starts getting out of hand very quickly and you get out of sorts. I was talking with someone the other day and they had a very, very large form and it was trying to do a lot of things and it was running away from them. They couldn't figure out why something was showing or wasn't. And it's because they're trying to go and look at all of these flows and all of these fields to figure out where am I going wrong. So the bigger and more mature or robust your application is, the worse this pattern is. And I would call this an anti-pattern. And that's what we're trying to do here is say, there's a better way and there's a better pattern for this. So once I've calculated everything and I've made, all I've done here is load into context. If you remember from last week's session, I've kind of made some variables for myself and I've done some math and I'm storing those there for a minute so that once I finally have everything, I can go ahead and update my assessment with these calculated values. And then maybe I'm going to generate a PDF and then I'm going to redirect them, right? So this got out of hand and I left this here because one of the things with Plantain App is our kind of philosophy is so much of the basics, the block and tackle stuff is so repeatable, right? Just being able to create and edit and read a record and see them listed, right? So we make it really easy just from when you make your data model, we set that canvas up and now we say, now make it special, right? If all this thing did was had me fill out the form and hit save, there's not much special about it. I could have probably done it in a spreadsheet. But the fact that I'm going to do all these calculations and I want to be able to maybe have a PDF of this and a file I can print out or email or send to myself and see in a more visually appealing format than just a really big long form that has some values on it. The way you would go and start replacing that, and that's what I've done, and we'll take a quick demo here in a second, is that all these steps, like 10 steps that are down here, have now been replaced by one workflow. And that's execute, update, assessment, calculations. And I pass one value into it, and it takes care of all of this other stuff for me. And then it shows me a message that says, hey, you're good. You're done, and kind of left things at PDF and email coming soon. And that's what, we'll probably do the PDF together and make a workflow. I've kind of left us at a spot where we can go to the next step. But I just wanted to kind of show that let's fill this out together and take it from zero. So I've got a person that probably is filling this out or is using this. Right now it's kind of internal. You start small and you just say, look, let me get the block and tackle working. And that's kind of what you see here as a canvas for myself as I'm building. As you go and you know that everything's working good and you've got all your pieces and your components and your workflows, then you tie it all together and kind of give that polished final product. So I kind of leave things open here while I'm working. And normally this would be like the user that's signed in, it'll default to them, something like that. So what am I build or buy calculating, right? And let's say it's a help desk solution. Should I build one or buy one, right? And if I'm going to buy it, let's say it costs $2,000 a year. That's all I kind of need to know there, right? And again, another great example is maybe I'm going to buy, super help desk, or, I can basically say, look, I can run these for several different options I have. Maybe one of them is worth buying, right? So there's a kind of an idea or a purpose behind being able to store these and save them off, and I can do comparisons and things. And so how many people is it going to take if I want to build it myself? In this example, let's say it's one employee and it's going to take them 2 months. They make $1,000 a month, or that's what they cost me just in salary. But then there's always some overhead, maybe some benefits and perks and taxes and different things that I also have to pay on an employee. So that's 25%. Again, we can pretty and fancy these sort of things up, make a nice little slider, some choices, but we just want to keep things kind of down to the real math right now while we're building and making sure that things work. Once everything works, we can come and put some panache on it, right? And then very important kind of follow-up is how many days of maintenance a month? How often are they going to have to maintain this? So let's just say it's, and again, it doesn't mean like on the 3rd Tuesday of the month, they spend a whole day working, but maybe it's about 8 hours a month, right? So we're just going to say it's about a day of maintenance a month throughout the month to do this. So these are zeroed out right now, and we can make it in reality where these don't show. This is, again, kind of output from me at the moment, but let's go ahead and calculate this one. And so it's telling me it's all done. Let's go take a look at what was created. And so I've got this help desk solution. It's ID 16. So let's just kind of plug that in. We can also, I have currently disabled the redirect and the pop-ups and all of that sort of thing that would navigate me to my next step. That's kind of laid in there. But remember, we're coming and we're solving the workflow part. It wasn't 14, what was it? 16. And can everyone see my text okay? Is it a eye chart, or, because I can zoom more. I think I will. Okay, so now we can see a couple things have changed here, right? I've got some values and fields that weren't shown initially that are shown. And now it's telling me, hey, to build it, it's going to cost you $2,500, okay? And annual maintenance on that, just that 8 hours a month, is $681.82 a year that it's going to cost to keep carrying and feeding and extending this thing. But you're going to save over buying and paying that $2,000 license fee. You're going to save $1,300 a year, right? And it's about 1.9 years to profit. And so we can see that our recommendation then is to build, okay? Because we said anything less than 3 years is a thumbs up for building it yourself. Now, what if I came and I said that it was going to take, 11 months to build it, okay? And so you'll notice I've got another button here, recalculate build or buy, right? And there's also create PDF. Let's refresh this and we'll see, well, now it's telling me, hang on a second, you should buy, right? It's going to take you 10 years to be profitable on this deal. It's just better to buy the product at this point. So what I want to show is how are these calculations and all of this happening? And in order to do that, let's take a look kind of behind the scenes, and let's open up our app builder. And there's some workflows involved. And if you remember, I was saying there was one magic workflow that was doing all of this for me, right? And that was update assessment calculation. So let's take a peek in that one. And by itself, I mean, it's a bit of a heavy hitter. It's got many steps in it. But what you'll notice is, kind of first thing it does, and this was built prior to having the required fields, right? And so this is me having to go, before I go and start doing all of this stuff, I better make sure the assessment actually exists. That ID they gave me, I need to know that it's a valid one. And a couple things I like to do in workflows, and I'm gonna, wrap with you guys a little bit, because some of this is, again, about, and I think, as we mature as a company and we've got so many years of building these systems and building the tool, we are seeing some best practices and patterns that we're using. And I want to kind of share some of that stuff with you all, give you some ideas, And so one thing I like to do, especially when there's a lot of workflows, you kind of start a initial action, which is just to put into context couple of things, like if my workflow is going to return back a status to me, especially in one like this, was I successful or not, right? And there's so many maybe places that I can go wrong or fail. I need something at least to report back to me, where did I make it to? So I just set status here initially to just init, meaning I just initialized. I made it to step 1, nothing has happened yet. And my description is status is not set. Because what I'm checking is the workflow has a field that's a status. Is it a draft? Is it done, right? And I only want workflows that I know I have a valid workflow, not in kind of going back to that required field thing. So theoretically, technically, this should be a required field by that new features standard. Don't even try if there wasn't a value here, right? So we'll go ahead and check that now. That's protecting against just no data coming in. But what if, and you'll notice, when I'm looking and I've been testing and playing, I've got some gaps in my data, in my IDs, right? Like remember when I was saying initially, I kept hitting the button and it was telling me error, but it was erroring after the step where I was inserting into the table, right? So I had a lot of, even here, you can see test, it's all the same values and same data, right? So I cleaned a bunch of those out along the way. I left a couple for this very example, is that if I were to give an ID of 5 into my workflow right now, there actually is no assessment with 5. It's gone out of the database. But I would technically pass the requirement of you gave me a value, right? And so if all I was doing was just worrying about, hey, is there a number here for an ID? Go and try to update the record and fetch data out of it. I'm going to fail, right? And so that's what this one does. I basically picked a field. Status is one that I kind of control, and I know that if it's empty, I shouldn't try to do anything else because I don't have a valid record at this point to work with. When I come into this workflow, and if I could just hop back for 1 second, I should and could and would and will pull out, I think, this first action, which is where it just depends. It's up to you. You don't have to get carried away with workflows. So you'll notice there is an action, create new assessment. In this case, all I'm doing is taking the form field values and I'm saying create a record off of them, right? Now I go and I say so that I can get an ID back, right? Now I could make a workflow that's just for inserting records and all it would have is this action. If I'm in a position in an application where I am inserting a lot of these into the database, I don't want to fill this out over and over and over again. And if one field changes, I'm in trouble, right? I would make a workflow just for doing this simple action, but I don't really have a use case for reuse right now. This is the only form for my app that is going to take these values and insert a record. So I feel okay about leaving this action here. What this action does when I insert a record, it gives me back the ID as an output token of the record that was just created. And that's what I go ahead and pass into my kind of mega workflow, the workflow that orchestrates and does it all. And so I know that when I'm coming into this workflow, this step, there is a record that exists. Whether I'm updating it or I just created it, right, for the first time, there is going to be an ID, and I'll know that there's an ID and it's valid because there's going to be a status. And so again, kind of a little trick, if the status is this little equals 0 is a way for me to say, look, if it was just empty, right, for some reason, default it to 0, right? Otherwise, use its actual value. And I say, hey, if it's greater than 0, next kind of pattern I want to show here is instead of having to open all of these up, I know that this meant I was good, right? And I'm going to initialize some parameters. So in the normal course of actions, and we'll take a look here, we can say record exists, set default, params for the next step or something, right? And over here, you'll see that this one is when there was an error, status not set, and set some things up for me. And ultimately my workflow is going to return this status after it runs. And if it got to here, if it never ran this or if something was bad in my logic of evaluating, I'm going to get back a status of init, and just means all I made it to is my initialization step. If I get here and nothing else runs after because I'm checking some of these values saying don't run the next step if what I got to here isn't something valid. If status, basically you can just start checking then status on all your other conditional or major heavy hitting actions and saying, if status is error, don't do this step, skip it, right? One of the features that we've had requested and is coming is the ability to kind of abort out. Right now, when you do these splits and you're kind of going to run the whole gauntlet of the workflow, right? But at this point, what I would like to do is end this workflow if I had this happen to me, right? But I'm kind of forced right now to keep going. And so I'm putting this protection in place for myself to make sure I don't erroneously run actions that are going to fail or worse, do harm to my data. And so these comments that I'm showing up here that I'm annotating inside the workflow, I would liken them to when you're in your form building, you have this description, and it's a super handy field, right? I can say, run the workflow, whatever I type here. This is really a developer description. This is a note back to me that lets me know, because again, when you start getting 10 steps, it all makes sense while you're building it. You come back in some of that maintenance a month later, 2 months later, someone new joins the team, you hand it off, whatever. They're not going to know what this stuff was or what you were thinking or why you did it this way, right? This is like the equivalent of commenting your code. And so run the workflow that, you know, does it all, right? And this shows up here. Well, in the workflow world, I still have this description, but it's not exposed to me. So I can still put stuff here. Maybe these are my extra deeper notes, my thoughts, things like that. So I still say use this. This is great. Fill it out, right? Especially when you have similar actions you're taking and there's just very little difference in them. Why this, right? Why do I have 2 of these? Anything like that. But that's not going to show up to you without drilling in, right? And so here, you know, I can say status not set. You know, the assessment status not set, you know, workflow error for my parameter or whatever, right? And so these are always here. And now kind of as I'm going, right? And you want to decorate your workflow with these, right? And so you can start explaining, you know, this split, you know, even here. Why am I doing this split? Make sure we have a good record to work with, right? So now I kind of can, when I'm zooming out and I'm trying to understand what does this thing do later, I'm going to know, why did I do this split? What are these different things here? And the key thing to this workflow, and that was the other pattern I want to show, and this is where we're going to kind of take a look and go a little deeper, is what you'll notice is this is actually, it looks like 4 steps, but it's actually a whole lot of steps that are happening. And what's really happening here is that I am executing another workflow, right? So this is the pattern number 2, right? Or 3, I would say at this point. One is to kind of initialize and have your workflow return a status. When you run our tester, it's going to tell you success, just meaning that it ran, right? But that's from a system platform standpoint. You should, especially, I think it's a great pattern to use everywhere, always set and return yourself a status, right? That means something to you. Yeah, the workflow ran, but did the logic inside of it execute successfully or not, right? And so initialize that. That was tip number 1, pattern number 1. Number 2, annotate. Describe to yourself what you're doing and why you're doing it so that it can be clues to you to know, do I drill in here or not, right? And so this workflow is to calculate the savings, right? And we're going to take a look at it. But you'll see that what I've done is separate things out. So this is the crux of the application, really, is doing all that math and kind of calculating the costs and the savings and things like that. It actually, that's where I ran into trouble 2 weeks ago. And that was where I ended up creating all those junk records, was trying to tune and find what's wrong in my formula, what's wrong in my syntax, why isn't my math working, right? Now, what happens if you've got this really long list here, right, of stuff that happens? Maybe I think this is my problem here, right? And like something's failing here. Maybe an error was emitted or a clue or something to let me know I need to fix this math maybe. Maybe I was missing a bracket. Sometimes parentheses kill you, right? Or not closing things out. And so if I wanted to keep using my form to test that, I'm going to come and say, well, I don't want to update the database. I don't want to create a PDF right now. I'm probably going to come and do something like this, right? Condition, meaning conditionally run this or not. I'm going to put like zeros or falses here, right? So I can kind of say comment all this out so I can keep hitting the button and trying to build. Then you got to remember to remove all of these, right? So that's what the workflow, one of the big things the workflow is getting you is to break things into smaller chunks and standalone things. This stands on its own. It's a value by itself to calculate savings. And I'm going to hop over in another tab for a minute, and let's take a look at kind of what this calculate savings does, right? And before I even jump into it, let's just demo it. So also, maybe another tip, give yourself a good description, right? I know it's like when you're moving fast, a lot of times it's like, yeah, the name implies it all, right? But, you know, leave yourself a clue. What does it take in? Is there any gotchas, any warnings you want to leave yourself? Like, you know, Dale showed last week that you can go to the automation and you can schedule the running of workflows, right? Well, all workflows aren't created equal. This one, completely harmless, right? I can say one employee, 1 month, I'm just gonna do simple math here, $100. If I buy, let's say it's $1,000 and it's 1 day of maintenance, right? Those were my kind of key inputs that that are driving my calculations. And just off that, I can return, I get back the cost to build. It's $100 to build it, right? It's $54 to maintain it. It's going to give me a savings of $945 a year. I break even in basically a month, you know? And I even, for myself, when I was troubleshooting, and that's where I ran into trouble, you'll see this, hey, employee cost daily, what is this? That wasn't anywhere in the calculator. No, but that's one of the things that I end up needing. If I'm gonna say it's a day of maintenance a month, that's really the cost times 12. That is what's your annual maintenance. And that's where I had an issue. And so, you know, also you'll look, and there's a lot more power in workflows. In the form we were using before, I was using these context things, right? And handy, I can do simple math and things like that here, but much more powerful and makes more sense to use in a workflow and so let's look at this calculate savings. And you see, so I've got things kind of, hey, this one right here, see, I'm just executing JavaScript. So you've got this execute JavaScript server-side action, right? And I can do much more powerful math. I don't have to just set and calculate one thing at a time and pass it on to the next thing. I did have the need to break these up a little bit, but I can take my variables, the inputs that are coming in, that are passed in as the inputs of the workflow, and they automatically are available to me to use right here in this JavaScript. And JavaScript made a lot of sense. We don't need to get into the math, but you can see I'm calculating things like the cost to build, that kind of stuff. And I needed to know what was my employee daily cost. And I had a problem with that, a rounding error, and it was throwing everything off. And I was able to find that very easily. And this was my first workflow I made, actually. And I even just plugged it into the form. So you don't have to do all or nothing. If you've got something existing and it's starting to get away from you, take a slice, you know, you don't reinvent it all, but go, I'm running into trouble here. There's complexity here. Why don't I replace these 3 steps with a workflow, right? And then later come back, or step by step, start replacing pieces with a workflow. Clues that, you know, you should use workflows. Complexity, you're finding yourself restating and using the same action and configuring it or cloning it and copying it all over the place. This is when you should pull something out and put it into a workflow and then reuse it that way, right? And so what this one does to do that is I go ahead and calculate the costs. I still, like you saw in my JavaScript, I had little abbreviations and letters and things. And so I still like to have nice, cleaner, friendlier names that I can pass back and out that's going to maybe mean more to me in my application or whatever. So I do all the dirty work in the JavaScript, and then I kind of map that over to some friendlier names. I could have used these names, but I would have been retyping that over and over in JavaScript. And maybe that's why I'm drawn to low code. I'm lazy. I just want things to work. So another JavaScript here. So this one is calculating the cost to the savings, actually. So, you know, really this is setting. The other one, the first one is calculating. This is set calculate costs. This is calculating savings. So, you know, I did some annotation here. I should annotate this too, but we get the pattern here. This one is alluding to that. Now that I know what it costs, now that I know what my savings are going to be, the last thing I do is I calculate my years to profit, right? And I set that up. Another great thing about using workflows is that when I'm troubleshooting, right? Inputs, kind of a big deal. You want to think about these up front, and you can change them, you can rename them, you can always add or remove input parameters. But remember, the input parameters, the places where you're actually going and calling the workflow, they're basically asking you, what do you want to pass in here, right? So if you change these too much, you got a little bit of work to do. You got to go find where you're calling it and adjust. Output parameters are cheap and free, right? If you're using them for something downstream, be careful. So some of these, like these first 4, are vital to what I'm trying to do. This employee daily cost, that was just, I could delete this if I wanted, but I've left it because it's handy for me as I'm going back and looking at this, troubleshooting, whatever. You can always throw something on here, right? That is giving yourself a little troubleshooting, a clue, some sort of other action. What are my values that I'm working with? Sometimes when you're trying to debug and you're going, look, this math isn't working. Why isn't, in my case, that was what was happening, is the employee cost was 0. It was coming out to 0. And so when I would do my subtraction, like I wasn't minusing off the cost of it looked like everything was like free. And it was because it looked like my employees didn't cost anything. Took me a few rounds of writing out some of these debugs here to go, what's going on in this step? What does it think the value is, right? And so you can spit that stuff out to yourself, and it hurts nothing when you're using you're calling and executing the workflow. Just, you don't use the thing, you don't use the thing. It's returned, but you don't have to do anything with it, right? So kind of going back to the mega workflow here. I have, so I've executed calculate savings. Now that I know some of those key fields that come out of there, I'm going to update my assessment, right? So I'm going to say, hey, the stuff that came back to me from that workflow, and I like to, by the way, name things the same thing when you can. You'll notice I kind of didn't do that on this part right here. And now I got some gymnastics to keep track of, right? My personal preference and usually in general, and when I'm not just kind of trying to do a demo, but whiteboarding and thinking about my app, preserve your naming, right? It just makes it easy to know what things are going to be. A lot of copy paste and reuse can happen for you. Remember, context matters, right? So this cost to build only matters in the context of the entity. This one here only matters in the context of this workflow. That's why they can be named the same thing, right? And not collide with each other. Just depends where you're using them. So all I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, go ahead now and update those key fields, right? Then I haven't, now that I've got my workflow, so far what's happened is the workflow has taken the user input off the form, saved it verbatim. I've come and I said, take the user input, and I only had that one parameter. Oops, I've kind of zoomed myself out of existence here. Let's refresh. Let me try. I think Zoom itself is killing me here. So so I have one input, and it's an entity, right? And it's the assessment entity, and it was saying, what's the ID of the one you're working with, right? And that's where everything's kind of been flowing from. From that one special, when you have an entity as an input, it's a very special input, right? I could have just done an integer and said, here's the number, but then I would have had to go and run some action to look up and read and get all these values. When you map to an entity as an input, you get all the fields automatically with a syntax of whatever you named it, colon, and the field name, right? So now I've got another workflow that is executing it's basically just saying, should I make the determination now that I know everything, right? I know what it's going to cost. I know how many employees. I know what it's going to cost to buy, all that year. And the key is I know the years to profit, right? So now let's go ahead and make the determination of build or buy, right? And give that back. So that's a workflow that figures that out. And then the last step is to actually update my database with that. Now, if I had a problem, I inject some data here and I say, error, abort Will Robinson, don't go mess with my database and run everything, right? And so now when I test the this workflow does things, right? So anytime I give a number here, I mean, it's super handy. I don't have to fill out that form anymore on the page. I don't have to, keep refreshing and resubmitting and all of that stuff. I can just run and test from the workflow tester, right? But when I'm trying to, this is killing me of why I can't see. my screen. Okay. We're going to call those bad tabs at this point. So calculating build or buy, why that matters is I can come and I can say it takes an assessment ID. 16 was the one that we were working with, right? And the key is that there's a whole bunch of logic there. And anytime that this particular one is run, no harm done, no database touched, right? I basically am seeing that, hey, it ran this, these are my statuses, right? So you see the plantain app status is completed successfully, right? But I made my own output parameters for status, and it's saying basically the description is, hey, we were successful, rating was set to buy. And then the actual only field I really cared about was buy. Now, I had a little bit of troubleshooting going on. Wait a minute, this thing was going to take 10 years and it's telling me to build. So I needed to know, well, what does it think the years to profit are inside of it? So I just put that on as an output parameter. And now I can, with my eyeball from right here, without having to look in there, I can validate, is this right? Because we said less than 3 years is a build, more than 3 years is a buy. And so this number in my head should always match up with what my expectations about build or buy are, right? So that one workflow on the form, when I push the button, it zooms through and it figures out and does a whole bunch of stuff, but it's made up of smaller workflows, right? And I know we're kind of getting at time and I want to leave some time for questions, but another great, so if this whole example app hasn't resonated with you, my key to my message is, and this was kind of the next couple things that I'm going to build into the application, is now that I'm calculating and storing everything correctly, I want to make a pretty PDF out of it, right? That has some of this text where I've got my placeholder formulas. I want to show my math, right? So if I'm recommending to someone, hey, you should get Plantain app and build your own apps, it's a better deal for you, right? I want to actually show the math of where I came up with this, right? So I'm going to take this text right here and I'm going to, dynamically put the math in there and kind of show all the steps that came out to this recommendation. And you also see down here, I've got kind of the values. We'll pretty them up, put some dollar signs, that kind of stuff. I'm going to put a cool graphic or kind of font awesome icon that when it's by, give me a little cash type thing, or give me a hammer when it's billed, right? But I've already got a start of what I want my PDF to look like. Now I'm just going to plug some tokens in, and I need to make that a PDF. Again, what did we learn today? On this create PDF button, should I go and put the PDF steps and figure out how this thing should look and all of that? Absolutely not. What I should do, and this one is like, again, with that import export ability we have, these are super handy things you're going to find yourself using and reusing a lot. I would say first kind of gravy use of this import export is make yourself a generate PDF one, right? Anything that I pass into here, right? So I'm going to test this one. And I can, in this case, I like to use tokens. Like I could just write pure HTML if I wanted, but I have like I have a token here. Well, here, just for time's sake, right? I can put a token in here, and that's what I would normally do. Somewhere else, I'm going to figure out what is my HTML that should get turned into a PDF in some other workflow. I'm going to build up that payload. That's a separate workflow, so I can test. I can see, is everything right? I can troubleshoot. Do I have good looking output with the right data on it? That's a separate matter from turning it into a PDF. So I would, again, make one of my kind of master workflows when I'm ready, and I'm going to say, all I got to do is give the ID of the assessment I'm interested in, and then it's going to call the make a pretty payload. And then it's going to call and pass in payload into generate PDF, right? And I can just say Reza 1, 2, 3. All this thing does is take those two things, and it's going to say, hey, I was successful. It's going to give me, I have choices of what I want back, but in this case, I wanted a link click URL so I can track clicks maybe if I want on the screen, but I also want to store on my entity, what's the absolute path to this PDF? And you can see here that if I just hit the go to, I've got the PDF, I just typed the word test, but anything I put in there is going to turn into a PDF. So I got a super handy reusable thing, and all it takes is two things for me to turn anything into a PDF. I don't have to keep setting that up. Even better example, the send email action, right? And so there's a lot of different fields and choices you have when you want to send an email, right? And my CCing, BCCing, all this stuff, my attaching files. Great if you're only going to ever send one email out of your application. However, more handy is to have a workflow that you can use anywhere. And these, out of all those options, these are the only things I care about when I want to send an email, right? And even better, kind of looking at our new fields, really, I only ever need 3 things to very quickly send emails out of my system, right? That are required. Who's it to? What's the subject? What's the body, right? Optionally, I can pass from in, and it will be from whoever I say it's from. I can CC or BCC, or give the path to my file, and now it's going to send, right? But I didn't go create a send the PDF that I just created for this app workflow. See, I will make one of those, and all it will do is call my other couple workflows, right? And record the results. So now when I'm going, my PDF is ugly, I can come troubleshoot my PDF workflow. When I'm saying, boy, my email is goofing up or not attaching the file, what's going on? I come troubleshoot my send email workflow. Once I've got this stuff dialed in and I start my next app, I'm gonna, my first step is to go and take some of my handy ones that I use and reuse, and I'm gonna export them out and start my new app just by pulling those right on in. So I know we're kind of a couple minutes at time. Hopefully I did better than last time, and you guys got some insight out of this. Any questions or comments?
Thanks, Reza. It was brilliant demo. I loved it. And we do have a question from Jim that is forward-looking. So in the upcoming workflow grouping feature, would a best practice be grouping safe, which means non-updating, workflow separately, or to use a naming convention within groups?
Jim, you're really on point today. I just want to say, we literally, so grouping is something that did not make it into 112 for that very reason. Easy enough to just give you, I mean, we have in tokens, conceptually, it's similar to this name spacing, right? And then you come and put like things. This is anything you want it to be. And you put the like stuff under it, right? What we got into is exactly that. Should I separate areas of my application by these groups, or should I separate them by, you know, are these high risk things and stuff? And so we can leave it to you and you decide how to use it, right? And I think I would say it depends on your app. If your app is simple, if all I'm gonna do is have build or buy app, right? I would probably group them the way you're saying. I would, and naming convention is another thing that helps you in this space, right? You can use the kind of underscore this or that. I tried here, like anything that's calculating is letting me know it's kind of all it's doing is calculating something. Anything that's updating my data in any way, shape, or form, right, is prefaced with update, right? So that's one way I achieved that here. So naming still will be your friend, even with grouping. I think so we're kind of still sorting that out. I think for now, it depends. If you've got a little bit bigger app, maybe I have 5 different calculators. My app really is called value calculators or something, right? And I've got ones that calculate ROI. You know, some of the stuff in here was like, what's the cost of an employee? Well, I just plug numbers in. We can make a calculator that figures out what is an employee cost, your breakouts, all that stuff, so that I can use it in another one of my calculators or assessments, right? In that case, I would want to group those like things together. I would have a group called builder by, and I'd put all this builder by stuff in there. I'd have another group maybe just called utilities, right? And generate PDFs, send email, that kind of stuff would go in there, right? But you bring an excellent point up, and that's why I think we're still trying to think, should we allow multi-grouping? Are we really talking about tagging here? Maybe we need both. And so you can say, hey, these are dangerous, for lack of better words. That's a separate matter than you having to specify or eat up good metadata for you to organize your application. But as always, and that's kind of our philosophy, is we're giving you the abilities. You play, you learn, you decide what's the best kind of way and pattern for you. And the biggest unfortunate answer is it depends on what you're building.
Good. Thanks, Reza. And also maybe I would just throw it out there that we are preparing a way to easily import and export this workflow and share with others, right? So a repository for workflows. So that will be very useful to get these kinds of workflows that we are doing, that you are doing, shared with other people in the community. So that will be a big milestone towards our goal to having a marketplace to share a lot more things than just workflows. So we are getting there, step by step. Cool. So thanks a lot, Reza. It was very, very nice seeing you work so tidy and explain the benefits of working tidy. And nothing broke today, so it was a good demo.
Well,
Cool. And thanks everyone for being here again in our edition 31 episode of Low Code Cafe. And we'll be seeing each other next week with more cool demos that we do. Thanks and have a wonderful morning, day, or evening.
bye, everyone.